About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he could not find a scientific explanation for. So with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
You've found Noetic Moments, the show that explores the research addressing what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives would be very different if we understood it better. I am Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and culture, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org, and Noetic is spelled Noetic. Now, over the course of these programs, we've looked at some of the models developed to explain our mental and emotional experience, and we've looked at the experiments that have supported them. We learned that although the medical world defines consciousness as what we're aware of now, most of what goes on in the mind is not in our conscious awareness at all, but goes on in unconscious processes. From Jung and Freud and other early researchers, we learned that our minds can be thought of as having three aspects: the personal awareness, our conscious mind, but what we aren't aware of that keeps our bodies going and includes our fears and beliefs about threats and dangers, the subconscious mind, and what we aren't aware of that connects us and guides us in our actions, the individual superconscious mind. Both play important roles. We then learned that we can change our state of consciousness and shift which aspects of mind we are aware of in the moment and what we're capable of. From neuroscientists, we learned that the brain modifies whatever it receives from both the bodily senses and the mind to fit past patterns of experience, following Begg's principle that neurons that fire together wire together, and forming what's called the default network in the brain. This means that we see, hear, and feel what we expect or what we believe we will experience. We also learned that while it's possible to say where in the brain various processes are active, no one has yet been able to pinpoint where memories are stored or how ideas and thoughts are formed in the brain tissue. We then saw that many responses in our body happen faster than nerve impulses or chemicals can travel, and often show up in the body before we are aware of it. As a result, many scientists have come to accept that what we call mind is not the product of the electrochemical activity of the brain, but is in fact the activity of a field that surrounds and permeates the brain and body. The brain, then, is best understood as a receiver-transmitter, receiving messages from the mind and transmitting them to the body, and receiving messages from the senses and transmitting them to the other parts of the body and to the mind. Some experiments have demonstrated that a person's mind continues to perceive and process for as much as several hours, even when the brain and heart are flatlined and the person has been declared dead. Mind, then, is a field, a pattern of energy that exists regardless of whether the body is functioning. It permeates and develops with the body and the brain as it is told by the senses through the brain what the body's experiences of the world out there is like. This field we call mind appears to be at least partly electromagnetic because it's possible to measure electromagnetic activity for several inches, even several feet, around the body. And some researchers, and the teachers of ancient traditions who we call shamans and yogis, say that that field looks like a glowing egg shape, extending from below our knees to a few inches above our heads. Now, every field is a unique pattern of vibration that's different from other fields, and some experiments have demonstrated that minds can vibrate along similar patterns. They resonate with each other. Their bodies and some of their pets' bodies have been measured as changing when someone they're connected with turns attention their way, even though they can't see or hear them doing so. These experiments help explain how the belief of a care provider in a treatment can help a patient receiving that treatment experience healing in what's called the placebo effect. We've learned also that mind affects matter and energy in a variety of other ways. For example, in the famous double-slit experiments in quantum physics, the subatomic building blocks of the universe show up as energy or matter depending on whether a mind is present to observe them. For decades now, individuals have changed the patterns of numbers in what should be random grids on their computer screens or printouts. And the collective human mind changes the readouts from random number generators on the network of computers that's run by the Global Consciousness Project in Princeton. Because of the nature of fields, and because of things like the Global Consciousness Project, a growing number of scientists are seeing our individual field of mind as part of a larger field, what Jung called a collective consciousness, Teilhard de Chardin called a noosphere, and others call a global brain. And more scientists are equating that mind with the quantum or zero-point field out of which all matter and energy arises, some calling it the Akashic field, using the Sanskrit term that means the essence of everything that exists in the material world. We've also heard from folks who are using the equations of quantum mechanics, relativity, and computer learning algorithms to describe the role of consciousness in the formation of matter. With these understandings, we explored some popular ideas about consciousness, including the law of attraction, how the world around us mirrors what our consciousness is focusing on, how we can access information in the quantum or Akashic field through insight, intuition, and channeling, how dreams affect the body and consciousness, how music affects the brain and body and our connections with other minds, and the role of mind and our state of consciousness in the healing process, how we can enhance or slow down healing through our thoughts, emotions, and visualizations, how remote viewing works, and how we can get into a state of flow in which the mind and the brain are in sync and maximizing our effectiveness. You can catch up on our past shows on our website, www.noeticmoments.org. where you'll also find links to the clips, books, and authors that I mention. Today, I thought we'd go back and listen to what Dr. Gary Schwartz, the director of the Institute for Consciousness Research at the University of Arizona, is saying about the shift that is happening in the sciences today. He is suggesting that shifting from a materialist view can lead to a new kind of science, a science based on what has been called in the past spirituality.
You need to do additional kinds of research, different methods, to come to the conclusion about whether or not we're dealing with a creator of consciousness or an antenna receiver for consciousness. And that's why the research that I and my colleagues have been doing on mediums, for example, is so important for neuroscience and the brain, because if the brain was the creator of consciousness, then when a person's brain died, their consciousness would cease, case closed. But if our brains are really TV systems, they're antenna receivers for our minds, Dr. William Hiller calls them biosuits, if you would, that then if our brains die and our body's physical die, our consciousness hasn't died, i.e. the signal hasn't disappeared, because that was not the origin of the signal in the first place. And therefore, other people's minds and brains, for example, the minds of mediums, could pick them up. And that's why I've done so much research under single-blind, double-blind, and triple-blind conditions, and they all point to the conclusion that some mediums are real, and that the information strongly supports the idea that consciousness survives physical death. And that's a post-materialist perspective. The claim that staunch materialists would like to make is that many of what are called near-death experiences can be explained as residual firing of either the cortex or subcortical structures after after it's been damaged or after the heart's stopped. The problem with that, I call it wishful thinking, is because if you look at the both human research and animal research, it's well documented that literally all electrical activity ceases within 40 seconds to a minute of the time that blood flow has stopped going to the brain. There is no evidence of electrical firing of the brain at all. So for people to therefore think that somehow, well, their brain is still firing, it's just that we can't electrically see it, the reason why they're pushed to that conclusion is because they find it impossible to believe that one's consciousness could continue after the brain had stopped functioning.
So Dr. Schwartz has been working with a variety of possible ways to understand what's really happening with consciousness, and in fact is working on a device that is designed to be a receiver of the consciousness that goes on after the body has terminated. I'm curious to see how that unfolds. Now, when Dr. Schwartz is talking about post-materialist science, he is saying we need to look at a different level of being beyond the body, other than the body. And fields are one way to talk about what he is exploring. Now, there are many traditions around the world that explore or explain the human experience in terms of multiple bodies, less and less material as we go forward. So there is the physical body. Then there is usually another body that is very much like the physical body, but is more space between the atoms, more energy than matter. And then there is one that has virtually no matter at all. It is almost all pure energy. It has just a little bit, just enough. So that would be the kind of body that perhaps one might call a spirit, and others would call the etheric body. So the physical body, what some people call the astral body, that has a lot less matter and more energy, and then the etheric body, which is almost entirely energy with just the last little vestiges of matter, and then ultimately the light body. And the mind is present through all of those, and in fact is sourced in the light body, which, according to most spiritual traditions, is not separated from all light everywhere, but is part of the one that is present everywhere. So a post-materialist science rapidly moves in the direction of what we call spirituality. And that form of spirituality is being taught more and more in a variety of what are called New Thought churches and learning centers. Our book today is written by our guest speaker, Gary Schwartz, and he calls it The Sacred Promise: How Science is Discovering Spirit's Collaboration with Us in Our Daily Lives. It came out in 2011, and is available in all the usual places. Dr. Schwartz, the cover says, candidly discusses the challenges as well as the rewards of connecting with spirit. He poses several important questions. What if our feelings of emptiness, loneliness, hopelessness, and meaningless are actually fostered by our belief in a materialist, spiritless universe? What if our physical hunger is symptomatic of a greater spiritual hunger? What if spirit is actually all around us, ready to fill us with energy, hope, and direction if we are ready to ingest it? Goes on, Sacred Promise shows how we can attune ourselves and receive the guidance from spirit, which is all scientifically documented by Dr. Schwartz experiments and research. So the book, as I said, was published in 2011. The publisher is Beyond Words Atria, which is actually one of my publishers. And what he is saying in the contents, Part 1, the sacred promise, the gravity of spirit. 2, the partnership with spirit, chapters 1 and 2. And then in Part 2, the promise of spirit's willful intent. Chapter 3, does Einstein still have a mind and can he prove it? 4, can necessity summon an inventive mother? 5, the helpful spirit go-between, and talks about a woman named Susie Smith who woke him up to this whole way of experiencing. Chapter 6, Princess Diana shows Spirit's intent to guide us and protect us. Part 3, the promise of Spirit-assisted healing. Chapter 7 is, can Spirit play a role in physical healing? 8, testing Spirit's presence in healing sessions. 9, a healer's spiritual lesson about the illusion of illness. And 10, the role of Spirit in emotional healing. In Part 4, he calls it the promise of a greater spiritual connection, the case for Spirit guides. Chapter 12, putting Angel Sophia and her intent to the test. Chapter 13, detecting the presence of angels in the biophoton laboratory. Chapter 14, the holy grail of communicating with Spirit. 15, learning to connect with Spirit. There is an afterword and an appendix that's frequently asked questions. Appendix B, risks and rewards. And Appendix C, are spirits illusory and are we fooling ourselves? And Appendix D, healthy and unhealthy skepticism about spirit. And there is a whole section of recommended reading in this book. So this is not the usual thing that you expect a neuroscience or an engineer, which is what his training was in, to begin to put together. He says in Chapter 1, in ancient times, people across the globe not only assumed that spirit existed, but they fervently believed that their ancestors continued to play a central role in their personal lives and the life of the community. People were encouraged to connect with not only their deceased ancestors and the Great Spirit, but also the living spirit of the earth, animals, plants, and even the stars. However, he says, humanity gradually shifted from encouraging people to have direct connections with spirit to sanctioning indirect contacts with a higher spiritual reality via rabbis or priests or other human leaders. In the process, daily spiritual contact was transformed into a practice primarily reserved for temple or church worship and even restricted to weekends. Then he says, let us consider a real-life situation in which spirit appears to have played a surprisingly collaborative role. He says, what I find most curious about this story is that it happened to me, a scientist who is open to, but also skeptical, of such occurrences. He goes on, he says, in the mid-1980s, an oral surgeon removed a large molar from my mouth, etc. He was expecting all kinds of things. However, in the late summer of 2008, the gums around the 2 teeth remaining became seriously inflamed. The teeth had become super sensitive to cold and hot substances. I could not put any pressure on them without experiencing severe pain. It had reached the point where I could drink only lukewarm liquids, and I was restricted to chewing entirely on my left side. Though I had been trained in various energy healing techniques while doing research for an earlier book, and even begun giving a weekly workshop, I had not thought to try any healing energy or spirit-assisted healing on myself. One night, as my mouth was throbbing and I was musing about all these implications, a novel thought popped into my head. I realized that although we were surrounded by all this air, it was up to us to breathe more deeply if we were to optimize its vitalizing and health effects, and that the same applied to water, and that it was up to us to drink more to optimize its vitalizing effects. I wondered if the same applied to all this spiritual energy around us, and that it was up to us to choose to use its vitalizing health effects. Simply stated, I realized that spirit might be like air and water. If we choose, we can learn to more effectively and mindfully partake of them for the sake of our vitality and health. He goes on several paragraphs. He was wondering what was possible, and then he said, I then said to myself something that I hoped I would not regret. I made a specific promise to the universe. I said that if my teeth and gums showed a rapid, dramatic, and permanent healing, even if they required my daily mindful attention, such as breathing extra air and drinking enough water does, as well as the daily invitation for the assistance of spirit, I would take this healing very seriously. I would not only respect and honor it, I would make sure others might benefit from it as well. To my utter amazement, he says, over the course of the next few days, my inflamed gums returned to a healthier state. My gums stopped bleeding when I brushed them, and they were minimally sensitive to touch. The persistent heat and cold sensitivity, as well as the pain, which had been present for months, decreased dramatically. I then extended this spirit-assisted dental practice and healing to the whole of my mouth. At the time I edited this chapter, in August 2010, my entire mouth was in the best shape it had been for more than 4 years. That is what he shares at the beginning of this book, The Sacred Promise, How Science is Discovering Spirit's Collaboration with Us in Our Daily Lives, by Gary E. Schwartz. Well, if you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments, the show that explores what consciousness is, what it does, and how our lives could be better if we understood it more fully. I'm Ruth Miller, and that sound tells me that it's time to let you know what's going on in the world today. Looking at the news, I'd like to explore the new research that suggests that what researchers thought we understood about brainwaves is not all there is. Now, we've been talking about brainwaves and their absence in what are called near-death experiences, and these are experiments that help us to see that we didn't know what we thought we understood. Over the last few years, one group of researchers has been studying the brainwaves of people who are in the dying process. This is a brand new concept. It happened accidentally and was reported in the news, and I talked about it a few months ago. So this was a study of 4 people who were going through the dying process, and 2 of those 4 people had what were experienced as rapid bursts of gamma-level brainwaves. Now that's very, very fast brainwaves, 50 to 80 cycles per second after the heart had flatlined and before the brain fully flatlined. So if you can imagine the monitors, the one beep has gone silent or it's doing its beep thing, and the other line is just winding down and then does and then goes flat. Because gamma is associated with dreams and hallucinations, these researchers think it's possible that much of what's called near-death experience happens during those few seconds. And we all have had that happen. We've been dreaming for what feels like days, and we come out and it's been 2 minutes, right? So, as Gary Schwartz has said in the clips we heard earlier, they may be clutching at straws in their attempt to support a materialist view, because a lot of people are not near death. They're actually dead for some time. In any case, it was a new idea and is opening the door to a whole bunch of new research on what is that process that happens at the end of life. And it's paralleled by another wonderful experiment. And this one has to do with octopuses. And yes, that is the correct plural. I checked it out. Now, some of you have encountered things like the film My Octopus Teacher, and you're aware that this incredible being is aware and playful and intelligent in that tiny little head. And, well, of course, how their minds work must be very different from ours, but they do seem to be willing to engage with us. So some researchers were able to plant very tiny electrodes in and around the brain and the eyes. And they found that not only do they have similar structures and patterns to human brainwaves, but that octopuses generate a wave pattern that has never been measured before. They are faster than the fastest such measurements in any of the animals or humans thus far documented, telling us that, yes, clearly something is going on there that will extend our understanding of how consciousness works in and through the brain. Very exciting research, because once people who have been using a particular form of measurement and getting particular sets of results for a long period of time encounter something that is totally unexpected, they will start looking at things with new eyes. And that is how we move from the kind of science we were practicing in the past to truly a new science for a new world. Well, we're out of time for today. But remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there's a list of the titles and other resources we refer to associated with each of the shows, and where you can send me your comments and questions, which I will do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments, recorded in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon. Have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.